So, welcome to our last discussion. My plan is to ignore all the promises I've made about looking at various other things and just begin with Socrates and make our way through a couple of descriptions of the reorientation of philosophy that he makes, look at some words in Greek on the way. And if we get through what Xenophon suggests to us, then maybe we can look back quickly at Philolaus and then go forward to what Plato says, because there's a direct link between the kind of thought that Philolaus represents, which is he can go directly to first principles from the phenomena, which is what Plato is denying, and which Socrates explains how he orientates himself philosophically. But that's to look ahead. What I'm going to do now is just look at this handout that I've just given you, and which I will immediately try and open and share online after I press a few buttons. Okay, so brief orientation. We have three texts discussing Socrates' reception of philosophy as the discovery of the notion of nature as a measure of thought and action, and how he radically changes it, which is the first great revolution within philosophy before modernity. Luca, do you want to grab one of, I've got one here if you want. Now this change that he effects is described by Cicero, and it's a very apt description, and so often quoted. If you're bored by it, I apologise, but it may be new to some of us, so we'll read it through. So Cicero says, from antiquity down to Socrates, who used to hear Archelaus. When someone ancient says used to hear or used to listen to, it's often translated as was a student of, because that's in the same way that lecturer means someone who reads things, because a lecturer gets a book from Plato or Aurelius or whoever and reads and interprets it for a class.
Sorry, Martin, could you speak up a bit, please?
Right. Let me just check that the microphone is the right one, and I'll turn it up as much as I can. One sec.
Thank you.
Right. Okay, I'll just try and speak up a bit, and yeah, let me know if I'm whispering. Is that okay, Alan?
That's better, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Okay, so let me just reshare. Okay, so Socrates used to listen to Archelaus, a student of Anaxagoras, which is of interest because in the lengthiest passage that we have, where Socrates discussed how he came to think the way he came to think, he discusses nameless people who wanted to reduce the phenomena to either material elements or mathematical elements, on the one hand, and Anaxagoras. So Anaxagoras was clearly of some importance, and that also is shown to us by the beginning of a dialogue called the Parmenides, where he's mentioned again. So Anaxagoras plays some kind of role in his turning philosophy around, and Aristotle says the same. In both Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle make the same joke, because Anaxagoras famously taught that the cosmos is ordered and caused by a nous, by a mind. And they both make the joke that he made no use of his mind, Anaxagoras, because when he came to discuss the cosmos, he didn't show how the intellect changed or moved or begat the cosmos. It's hilarious in context, but we have no context, so that joke will just have to pass unlaughed at. Okay, so down to Socrates. Philosophy used to deal with numbers and motion, mathematical physics, right? Except, of course, there's no mathematical physics in antiquity in the modern sense. And from where all things originate, come to be, and by what they pass away, the causes of becoming and destruction. and they diligently inquired into the magnitude of the stars, their distances, courses, and all of the heavens. The implication being that the causes of the cosmic things are similar to the causes of the human things. Socrates, however, was the first who brought philosophy down from the heavens, placed it in the cities, and introduced it into homes, and obliged it to examine into life and morals and good and evil. Now, the recent scholarship is it's becoming more and more historicist, and so this is a process of the last 200 years. We're going to try and get rid of the notion that there are exceptional people and exceptional ages, and everything is just a historical process with one epoch being caused by the previous one. And so that's why we don't say the Enlightenment, because there wasn't this distinct period where people tried to rethink the foundations of the sciences, political and natural. We're just going to call that the early modern period. It's just one more period with different speech about different things. Similarly with Socrates, if you look at the reason why the books that we're using for the pre-Socratics is now called either the first philosophers or the earliest philosophers, or early Greek philosophy is the title. Not the pre-Socratics, because Socrates is just someone influenced by someone before him. And of course, the pre-Socratics discussed life and morals. What they're covering over by that is that the way life is seen is radically different from the way Socrates sees life, which is that he is saying you cannot provide one understanding of the causation of a being that applies to all phenomena, cosmic, human, inanimate. You must approach each kind of being in its own way, appropriate to its own phenomena. That's just a hint. Okay, so, and now now a lot of people will say in the scholarship, Socrates brought philosophy down from the heavens and made it inquire into ethical matters. He wasn't interested in cosmological matters. They have one line from Aristotle that's useful for trying to show that. I don't have time to refute it, but that's not what he's doing. What he's doing is bringing the beginning of philosophy back to our ordinary understanding and our ordinary discourse. But it's still the beginning of the attempt to know the principles of all things. Okay. I'm suggesting that these are suggestions that would require evidence and so on. Okay. And his different methods of discussing questions. So I think Cicero understands some things very clearly. There's no one method. There's an approach, a philosophical approach, or a hodos. There's no methodos that applies to all things. Together with the variety of his topics and the greatness of his abilities, being immortalized by the memory and writings of Plato. So there's a distinct awareness of the necessity for a falsifying tradition if you want to perpetuate the activity of not being traditional, of thinking things through for yourself. Did that make sense? Or can I, if it sounds like sheer self-contradiction, let me know and I'll parse it. So Socrates' abilities on the one hand and his being immortalized by Plato on the other gave rise to many sects of philosophers of different sentiments, right? So that's the problem that I referred to a week or two ago, that Socrates represents thinking things through for oneself in conversation and not in conversation, just in conversation with oneself, anew, as if tradition can be bracketed and we can think through the tradition, but that in turn leads to not one philosophical approach, but many sects with their own convictions or dogmas or opinions. Now, so Cicero continues, of all which I have principally adhered to that one which, in my opinion, Socrates himself followed, and 1, argue so as to conceal my own opinion, while I deliver others from errors, and so discover what has the greatest appearance of probability in every question. I think that's a helpful introduction for several reasons, and our next step, I think, is to look at Xenophon's depiction of the same phenomenon, which is Socrates turning philosophy's approach around. Now, this is over the page, on page 2 of this handout.
So Martin, Xenophon was a contemporary of Socrates.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
Cicero,
yeah.
would he have had any more evidence of Socrates than we had from Aristotle? And
Oh, yeah.
He would have.
Because he went and studied in Athens and had lots of books that weren't available to us.
Yeah.
And lots of, books that were derivative from sects of,
Followers of Socrates.
and followers of,
cynics and stuff.
cynics, stoics, skeptics, so this is, so as Bernie mentioned, Xenophon knew Socrates. He happened to be away fighting in Persia when Socrates was put to death. But he wrote several books. He wrote books, one of which continues the history of Greece from where Thucydides' book left off. He wrote the book of when he was a mercenary with 10,000 other Greeks in Persia, which is a wonderful adventure story called the Anabasis, which we were reading with some St. John's people some months ago. I can't remember when.
Is it translated into English?
Yeah. And recently, actually, most of Xenophon has now been translated in the good translations, and they're all translated through Cornell University Press. That's where they are, isn't it? Yeah.
What was the university center?
Cornell.
Cornell.
Yeah. But when he wrote about Socrates, he called his book, in Latin, it's the Memorabilia. It's the Apomenu Menam Momena, something in Greek. But it's the things that are remembered, and as one of the most delicate readers of philosophy pointed out, Socrates Strauss, he means these are the things most worth remembering from my life, which is Socrates. So despite all these tremendous other historical and political and martial things he did, this is the key core of his life. Now, in this book, he starts by saying, I don't know how the Athenians managed to persuade, the prosecutors managed to persuade the Athenians to put Socrates to death. And then, throughout the rest of Book 1, he makes a defense of Socrates in which he quietly indicates exactly why they would be able to persuade the jury to put him to death. And so we'll see both sides of that in this passage. But the main point of this passage, which is why I've extracted it, so it's from Book 1 of Memorabilia, Chapter 1, and its sections or sentences 10 to 16. But the main reason I've extracted it is because here he makes an extended reflection upon the philosophers who came before him, and it's a very helpful way in to seeing how elusively Xenophon writes, and so we'll look at it slowly and carefully. So he starts off in this passage, but he was always in the open. So phaneros, phanera, phaneron is manifest. It's related to that final, bring into the light. So there's obviously there's a root, phi alpha, which has something to do with shining or light or clarity or manifestness. And it's shared by a number of words, including force. I'll just very quickly do this because it comes back. So we have that word phainor, which is something like I bring into light. And then if we put it into the middle, so that's the middle and passive spelling for phainor, phainomai, and so that would either be I bring myself into the light, or I am being brought to light. or brought into the light. Now, in the participles, the middle passive spelling for the participle is omenos, omener, omenon. I don't know, we touched on this for about 3 seconds, so if you don't remember it, that's not a crime. In the neuter plural, that's nomina, because the neuter plural is always alpha in the nominative and accusative. So, and in English, oops, started to go back in the wrong language. Yeah, phenomena. So the phenomena, because what you do first of all is you translate it into that diphthong is pronounced the same as the alpha iota diphthong in Greek, and so we translate it first into that phenomena, and then because we pronounce that diphthong is phenomena in Latin, but we pronounce it phenomena, right, in English, and so therefore we write that. These things happen all the time, and it's very annoying. Why can't people get their languages straight? Okay, but that's, yeah, so we get phenomena from phenomena indirectly.
It literally means that which is brought into the light, or?
Well, yeah, it's an argument, but the usual interpretation is that it's those things that are manifest because they have brought themselves into the light.
Those things that are manifest.
Yeah. Like a phenomenon is that which is manifest. Now, it's interesting because the way it was used by the people who people like Husserl and stuff, they want to talk about phenomena in a value-neutral way, like real scientists. It's just the phenomenon or the phenomena, singular or plural, and we'll discuss them and examine them without any presuppositions about there being better or worse or whatever. But you can't do that in human life at all, which is why people use phenomenon and phenomena as a term of rank or praise. That's a real phenomenon, right? It's just natural for humans because we cannot function. It's a betrayal of our experience to say that something is not better or worse in some respect. It's always better or worse. The grass is always healthier or less healthy. The instruments that you're using are always more useful or less useful, and so on. It's just impossible to experience or describe the world accurately without...
When we use it as a superlative, we're kind of saying it is singular.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, or it standds out from everything else.
Yeah, from everything else,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
But because phenomenologists got it from Kant's usage.
Well, yeah. And they say back to the Tafa phenomena. Yeah, away from Kant, but still they're trying to do it in a scientific sense, in the modern sense.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Right, it looks like someone has stolen my hidden paper, which is going to make... Oh well. But anyway, so the point I wanted to make before was, so there's this root, far, which means something like shining, visible, manifest, and that's why we have force, which is light. Like phosphoros is force, feror, bear, carry, right? Phosphorus is light carrying or fire carrying. And then we also have force, human, which is a very interesting conjunction. Does that mean that the human brings with them a region of visibility of what is manifest or something? It's but it would be interesting that that's located at the beginning of the language. Okay. Okay, we'll go back to the Xenophon. Okay, so we've made our way 6 words in. This is going to be... at dawn, he used to go to the walkways and gymnasiums, and when the marketplace was full, he was in the open, and for the rest of the day, he was wherever he could be with the most people. This is ironic when you read the rest of the book. because he spends his time in corners or in private houses, or he's very rarely out in the open, but leaving that aside. But no one ever saw Socrates doing or heard him saying, so 2 activities, just keep that in mind for the moment. Anything irreverent or impious. Now, if you look down at the footnote, this is very slightly later in the same chapter. Socrates believed that the gods know all things, both those which are said and those which are done and those which are silently deliberated. 3 activities, right? So what's the activity missing from from the sentence 11?
Silent liberation.
Very good. Right, so that should give one pause about this straightforward declaration, right? It misses out one of the 3 activities that by which he has Socrates himself defined the human being. Silent deliberation, acting and speaking. Okay, for he did not even converse about the nature of all things, right? And unfortunately that letter has turned into a bracket. But that should be peri tes panton physios. And we've had peri physios, about nature, and panton is of all things, the gender plural. Okay, he did not converse about the nature of all things. Now, as a blank statement so far, that's going to be difficult to maintain. But with the rest of it, in the manner of most of the others. Now, a lot of scholars do want to say Socrates did not talk about the cosmos. And I think I've tried to say that that's inadequate, and we'll see why shortly. But he did so not in the manner of most of the others. That's true. Okay, but he's now saying that he didn't do it by examining the condition of what the sophists call the cosmos, and by what necessities everything in the heavens comes to be. And in fact, he even declared that those who ponder such things were mad. Okay, so he's made a suggestion that the cosmologists, the physiologists, are mad. And now we're going to get that comparison is going to be picked up, and it seems casual, but there's a far more detailed structure that we're going to be able to examine as we go. Okay, so, and you can see I've put in bold the 2 phases of this examination. And he first examined them, blah, 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 and then later on the page, he also used to examine them. So there are 2 aspects, and we'll spend most of our time on the first, because it's the one of most interest. He first examined them as regards whether it was because they believed they already knew the human things, ta and anthropina. So there's an adjective anthropinos, anthropina, anthropiner, anthropinon. This is ta, anthropina, the neuter plural, but the ta, the alpha of the ta, the definite article, has contracted with the beginning of the word. And you can see there's still what looks like a smooth breathing. It's actually not a breathing, because the word now begins with a consonant. It just indicates there's been this contraction. Okay, so he first examined whether they already knew the human thing sufficiently that they are going to ponder such things. Right? So or having passed by the human things, are they convinced that it's through examining, I've just said, the supra-human things, ta daimonia. So it's very difficult to translate words that have the root daimon. A daimon can straightforwardly be a god in Homer and in Plato, but it has an ambiguous status because sometimes it's defined precisely as the offspring of a god and a human. So a daimon is like a nymph or someone else who has this semi-divine status. And the adjective that comes from daimon, daimonios, daimonia, daimonion, daimonic, means something like divine, but it's not quite the same as theos that comes from the word theos or theia, a god or a goddess. So the supra-human, the divine, and he's associating that here with the cosmos as a whole. Right? So so without having examined the human things, that they can go on and examine the supra-human, the cosmic things, the divine things, that they will practice what is fitting. That is, suggestion, if you don't examine the human being on its own level, then how would you be able to show that you're doing what you're doing is what is good for a human being? And he used to wonder, and I just put the word there, it's in the imperfect tense, but I'll just very briefly, there's this, in the present tense, we have this word, thou mazdor, which means I am either, wondering is the traditional translation in certain contexts, or it's I'm, being astonished, or shocked, or amazed. So I am admiring, but in a very strong sense. But wonder is a traditional translation in certain contexts, because it just happens that in the Theaetetus, Plato has Socrates say that philosophy is the beginning of wonder to a young man who he's just confused. And Theaetetus says, I wonder about, or I'm astonished by the fact that you've just said this, but this. And Socrates says, well, that's a very philosophical passion. And Aristotle says the same in Book 1 of the Metaphysics, that thou Mazdain, both long ago and now, is the beginning of philosophy. And I just thought, so before that word, Throrpina. So, the human things. And you get that Crassus, where the, instead of a breathing, you have this mark. It's just a mark saying that there's been a contraction of these two elements. Okay, so he used to wonder if it was not manifest to them that it's not possible for human beings to discover such things, since he wondered why even those who thought the most of themselves for speaking about these things did not hold the same opinions as one another, but instead they're disposed to one another like those who are mad. For among the mad, now this seems like a digression, and like many important things in Xenophon and Plato and Aristotle, it just seems to be off the track, but it's actually the key to how to understand the next passage. And I'm going to put this on the board as we go. Because he's going to mention 3 different passions and then 3 different opinions held by these previous philosophers. First passion has to do with fear. And this is about people who are mad, right? Mad cosmologists. Okay, so he used to, among the mad, he wondered that some are not even scared of terrifying things, so no fear even of things that are genuinely fearful. And the word is dana, which is another word that's difficult to translate. And others are afraid of things that aren't frightening. And some have the opinion that it's not shameful to do or say anything at all. So the second one concerns shame. And the first group of mad people have no shame. Others are of opinion that one must not even go out among human beings, right? Now, he's talking here about human beings, shame before human beings. Now, shame is a qualification of fear because it's a fear of disgrace. A fear of doing something, I mean, in the Greek word, it's a fear of doing something ugly. Right? So it's a fear of manifestly being ugly or ignoble. So a fear of disgrace. Okay. And they build, I'm suggesting, these categories. Okay, others have the opinion that one must not, we've done that. Some don't honour temple or altar or anything else divine. So the last one has to do with piety or honouring the divine in some way, right? Some honour nothing. While others revere chance pieces of stone and wood and wild beasts. So honour, I'm just going to say random things. Now, piety is a qualification of the fear of disgrace because it's the particular fear of disgrace before the divine. I'm not saying that's a perfect definition, it's just a suggestion. Okay, so he's described six kinds of madness. And then he says, and of those, he just looks disconnected. And then he says, and of those most concerned to think about the nature of all things. He used to wonder that some have the opinion that being is one. So we have our famous hen to on. So now beings. To on hen SD. Being is one. Others, that it is indefinite. Indefinite could be infinite. In number or in multitude. Multitude is better because it's not definite. And he used to wonder that some have the opinion that all things are always changing or in motion. Okay, so this has to do with motion. Everything is always changing or in motion. But others that nothing is ever changed or in motion. Okay, so. Now, motion is a qualification of the question of whether or not there are many beings. You need a multitude of beings if you're going to have motion. Right? Or maybe a mover and a moved, or a place from which you move and a place to which you move, or if it's change, then you're changing it from one character to another. We immediately have a multitude of attributes and beings, if there is motion. So that's the qualification in that direction. Okay. And for some, all things come to be. So this has to do with becoming. All things come about and perish. But for others, nothing either comes to be or perishes. I thought I had this better worked out before. Now, the question is, clearly, becoming requires motion and a multitude of beings. So we still have that development. And the question that Xenophon doesn't even suggest to us, but we have to make, is what's the relation between these? Now, here's a possible suggestion. If being is one, then there's nothing other than you. There's no other at all. Nothing can affect you or harm you. So there will be no reason to have fear. If being is infinite and indefinite, then there is an infinite and indefinite sources of possible danger. So everything is a possible occasion for fear. That might make some sense. If everything is always changing and in motion, it means that there are no stable qualities of nobility and baseness. There's no fear of disgrace. So no shame before anything. If nothing is changing or in motion, and there is some stable standard of nobility and baseness, and it's unchanging, then that could lead to a fear of disgrace in any circumstance. That's difficult. We'll come back. Now, if all things come into being and perish, there's nothing lasting, therefore there's nothing really worthy of reverence. So you would honour nothing. If nothing comes to be and perishes, then that means everything is divine. There's not some separate divine thing, and therefore you would honour random things because they are an instantiation of the divine. Now, and the reason why we make the connection is because Socrates is trying to show that particular opinions open up the world in different ways. He's trying to connect psychology and cosmology, because psychology is, in a way, the first step to the genuine cosmology. The examination of our ordinary opinions about things is the first step to the genuine. The examination of our opinions and our attitudes and beliefs is the first step to the genuine cosmology. Now, I'm just going to cut to the chase a little bit with the following suggestion that I need some space to make. Both Socrates in both Xenophon and Plato is described as being moderate or sober in relation to his predecessors. And we had extremes of passions there, and you'll know from Aristotle's Ethics that in the ethical aspect of the ethics, not the intellectual, but in the, you can't be too intelligent or have too much wisdom or something, or too much friendship. That's all obviously true. But in the ethical things, you can have too much boldness, right? So that you go beyond being courageous to being reckless. You can have too much generosity because it goes beyond generosity to throwing your money away, and so on. There are the ethical virtues in Aristotle have this aim at the mean, what is appropriate for the circumstances. So what would be the mean be in these three? It would be not being too afraid and not being afraid of everything, right? Not being afraid of disgrace before things that aren't disgraceful, but being afraid of the things that are genuinely disgraceful, and showing reverence to those things that deserve reverence and not towards everything or nothing, right? That would be the moderate way. And then we also get a hint, we get a hint of the ethical side or the human side, and we get a hint of the cosmological side. So there are a multitude of beings, not an infinite number, but an encompassable number. Neither simply a one nor a many. And some are in motion, and some are unchanging. If you wanted to speak very simplistically, you could say there are phenomena, and there are their principles, forms, or causes. And then finally, some things come to be and perish, and some things don't. And that would also be the phenomena coming to be and pass away, and their principles or forms or causes are atemporal, asocial, alinguistic, and so on. Okay.
So, Martin, when you're thinking about the claim "only one is," are you thinking that in terms of the way Parmenides put it, or for example, to say that biological life on Earth is one? It has the one origin, it's all connected, it's one, but it has a lot of difference in it. Or is this Parmenides one that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I'm not taking it.
Differentiate.
Yeah, I'm not taking it to be strictly as Parmenidean, but just as, because just as holding that thesis, which could be,
I mean, another way to put it might be to say, I think you almost suggested that, you say that only I as observer and experiencer exist, and that there's no other beings other than myself as an observer and experiencer. And is that one way of thinking about only one is?
Yeah, but if only one is, then that means you are the whole.
Yeah, and you're differentiated, extremely complex and everything.
Yeah, well, in our experience, yes.
Yeah.
But
because I was just reading the metaphysics, and this is, and I'm thinking, this is the way Aristotle said it. He says, is there one being, like individual wholes or whatever, that stuff, or are forms also beings and mathematical objects also beings? So if you said yes to those, then there would be three beings. If you said no to those, then there'd only be one being. So I'm wondering if that's only one is actually only individuals are.
yeah, I don't think it is here. I think he is like he's using this in the way that Parmenides is rhetorically spoken of, right? In order to make a different kind of point.
Yeah, and the second one and the third one might be Heraclitus or something.
Yeah,
version of Heraclitus.
Yeah, but I think he's trying to encompass the six possibilities. As extreme versions. So I don't think.
What are the options?
Yeah, which won't match what happens in the fragments of Heraclitus or Parmenides with any kind of fullness. It's just this is the abstract possibility. It'd be very interesting to look at the particular remarks that he makes about particular people. But here I think it's just these are the possibilities, and also it's this approach that we can go straight to the beings without going through the human things. And we get that first clue of that by the matching up of the psychology with the cosmology. Okay, so then we get to part two, which is the step that Socrates makes as a result of that thought. So he used also to examine them in this respect. just as those learning the human things are convinced that they will do, and I will stop here just for a second. So this word is poi, or which means do, act or make, which is why the noun that's related to it is poiesis, which, like physis, it's one of these third declension nouns that ends in is, aor's, feminine, which is traditionally translated poetry, but it means a doing or a making. Plato's agreement with Homer is that the highest form of making is to make the depictions of the gods, because you make a people through making a depiction of the gods. That's what he says in the Symposium. Okay. Now, and the word as we have it here is in where is it? Poiesein. So to say I make is poie, or I am making or doing. To make that into the future, you lengthen the epsilon to an eta and add a sigma, and then you have the future stem, poies. So poiesor, I will make, I will do. Poiesein is the infinitive, used for grammatical reasons that we don't want to contemplate at the moment, but I just wanted to bring out the stem there. So that whenever they wish, okay, so sorry, I think I went ahead to the second use of poiesein. The first one is just after the word, is just after the number 15. So he used to examine them in this respect, just as those learning the human things are convinced that they will do or make. Okay, you learn shoemaking, right? Once you've learnt it, you will go on and make those things, right? That they will do or make whatever they have learned, both for themselves and anyone else they wish. And that's important, because shoemaking, you can make shoes for others or for yourself. If philosophy may be unlike shoemaking in that respect, you may be able to learn without necessarily being able to convey it. It may be an activity that everyone has to undertake for themselves in some respect, unlike being fitted with a pair of shoes. Okay, so he says, are you like a shoemaker, right? Do those who inquire into the divine things believe that when they have recognized the necessities by which everything comes to be, that whenever they wish, they will make winds and waters and seasons and anything else they need of that sort. So that is almost like a summary of both Empedocles and Descartes. Empedocles is saying, yes, you will know the elements of all things the way that an artist knows all of the pigments of paint in order to make a particular painting. Or a carpenter knows feet and leather and nails in order to be able to make a well-fitting pair of shoes. Now, he is saying you will be able to, if you learn the necessities by which the cosmos operates, you will be able to manipulate it to your purposes. One, that's the practico-productive project that some of the ancients contemplated, and most of them appear to have deliberately rejected, and which the moderns picked up on and brought into practice and made manifest. Or do they not even hope for that sort of thing? Rather, it suffices for them just to recognize how each of these things becomes. Now, that appears to be the contemplated alternative, that the highest thing above making and doing is knowing. But it's not knowing something that is, it's knowing how things become, which is a problem, because what is the purpose of knowing the causes of ephemeral things, if not to manipulate them? Okay, he used to say such things. Okay, so then now he's concluding those two examinations, and then he just goes on to Socrates' typical approach. He used to say such things about those who made these matters their business, but he himself used to converse about the human things. So this sentence, along with that sentence I mentioned in Aristotle, is often used by people who want to say Socrates restricted himself to ethical questions because he was seeking definitions. right? Which is somewhat absurd, but we'll see where that comes from in the following sentences. So by examining what is pious, what impious, what is noble, that's that word kalos, kale, kalon, noble or beautiful, and what base, so iskros can be ugly or base because we have this correspondence between beauty and ugliness, nobility and baseness. What is just, what unjust, what is self-control, what is madness, what is courage, what is cowardice, what is a city, what is a statesman, what is the rule of human beings, and what is a ruler of human beings, and about everything else which he believed, those who know them. So he believed that if you have the answers to these questions, you would be noble and good. And those who are ignorant would justly be called servile, right? So Plato and Aristotle have a very, and Xenophon, have a delicate relation to slavery. Right? They did not at any point say slavery is wholly unjust and should be gotten rid of, because they didn't think it could. So Aristotle, in the beginning of the Politics, says, if we had iPhones that could play music upon request, then there will be no need for slaves. I mean, it's slightly different.
Liberal translation.
Yeah, that's a slightly liberal translation. He says, if we had machines such as Daedalus made, where this is a passage from Homer, where Homer himself says the tripods came into the hall of the gods, and the means of technical production moved themselves. And Aristotle expands on that and says, if the plectrum struck the kithara and produced the music by itself, there will be no need for slaves. All of these things that are currently done by people who have been enslaved would be done automatically. Automata, they'd be done automatically. So this would require maximum technical advancement. So that the modern project is therefore understood. And in book 2 of the Politics, so this is in book 1, and then book 2, he denies that we should maximize the arts and sciences. That would allow us to do this. And he knows slavery is unjust, and he explains why it's unjust in the first book. But then he explains why we can't advance technology in order to get rid of this injustice. Yes?
But does it not also mention that there are well, this is going a bit off topic, but he also says that there are natural slaves, such a thing as natural slaves, which is like,
Well, yeah, so he says, he says there are two main sides to this argument. One side says that some people are by nature slaves, and they mean the Persians, who we capture. Right? And some people say no one is by nature a slave, and all slavery is unjust. And he says there could be a slavery. Well, it's a longer argument, but he says, well, let's look at it from the point of view of the only principle that matters. What is by nature a slave? He says, by nature, you're a slave if you cannot think for yourself and you have to be told what to do for your own good. And then at the end of this passage, he says, so there would be, actually, he says there is a natural slave, and it's that person who is benefited by being a slave. And then he's inviting you to say, do we see any slave who is A, without any faculty for thinking for themselves, and B, benefited by being a slave? And then we see, no, that's not the case. So he provides us with the natural standard in order to be able to say, or conventional, slavery is unjust. That's my reading. I mean, and maybe that's wishful thinking. You could tell me it's wishful thinking, but that's what I think he's actually suggesting. And Plato in the Meno has a somewhat arrogant young aristocratic man, embarrassed by his inability to answer questions, and then he brings a slave from the company of this man and shows that the slave can learn something, whereas he can't learn something. So there are these touches that indicate that they do not hold the conventional views about these things. But from their point of view, the highest form of slavery is of the intellect, and that we all want to be free intellectually. The other form is obviously of incredible urgency and importance if, like Plato, you have been captured and enslaved 3 times, right? So this is a fate that befell many Greeks who were then, sometimes, as in Plato's case, he was ransomed by his friends. But I just want to bring that point up because that's what he's saying here. He's using this in this metaphorical sense of if you're completely ignorant, then you're beholden to other people's views on things. But the word, it's just interesting that he's using this phrase, if you understood these questions, the human questions on their own level, and you had answers to these questions, you would be noble and good. That's a redefinition of what is noble and good. I'll just show this because it indicates the way in which Plato and Aristotle and Xenophon approach ethics and politics. So that's not very good. So kalos, kai, agathos. So kalos, noble or beautiful. In this context, it's something more like the beauty of your character. So something more like nobility. Kai is and agathos is good. And good can have a utilitarian sense of good as in beneficial, right? So the word for an excellent human being in ordinary Greek is kalos kagathos, in which this chi has been contracted with the alpha at the beginning of agathos, as you can see indicated by this mark that indicate coronus, that indicates a contraction. So kalos kagathos, if you just see that phrase in a Greek text, it means like a gentleman, an excellent person. But that's being redefined. Like Socrates is redefining that to say, well, it's the person who's accomplished the intellectual questions about what a human being is. So he's redefined the person of ethical and political excellence as someone who's come to the end of philosophy, and which is I'm not going to say a trick, but it is part of the rhetorical intention of Xenophon, Plato, and Aristotle to say that within your admiration for people who are excellent in practice and in politics, what you are admiring is the intellectual capacity from which the action follows. And the highest example of that intellectual capacity would be a comprehensive human understanding, i.e. a successful philosophy. So what they're trying to do is show that within your admiration for practical success and learning and action is in fact an admiration for his activity. Now, I'm not saying that's immediately plausible or immediately persuasive, but that's what they're trying to show.
If you know what is good, you will do good. Is that?
Yes, but with the implication that you'll never know fully what's good.
Right.
That's the one thing that you'll never know. You'll never meet with the good in itself.
Yeah.
Or you won't have... This is why it's funny when people say he's seeking for definitions, because he's not seeking for definitions.
Right.
There's no... Yeah, it's like saying, is there a definition of being? Well, no.
Right.
But we're going too fast. Let's go back to our moderate Xenophontian text. Okay, so that is the end of this passage of Xenophon. So I introduced it partly because it's one of the 2 or 3 classic texts showing like Xenophon, like Cicero's description and Plato's in the Phaedo of what Socrates brought. But it also, I just think it's helpful to see how carefully Xenophon wrote in order to demand that you pick things out and work it through yourself.
Still not completely following. So Socrates, the Socratic turn in this sense here is that he said, don't just go and study science, you've got to study yourself first. You've got to study psychology or humanity first before you can understand nature. Is that?
Yeah, yes. And what he means is developed in that work in a different way, but I was going to then move to Plato, where we get a more detailed description of this link between the psychology and the cosmology.
Yeah, okay.
And yeah, we've...
So was he saying that the ends of philosophy are ultimately unknowable?
Well, if we have in Socrates someone who, we have I mean, both Xenophon and Plato say, here's a paradigm of the philosophical life. They appear to be presenting him to us as that. But he himself says, and appears to show, that he's not wise. He's raising these questions and pursuing them and coming across all kinds of answers and learning, but not becoming wise. So I think, and there are various ways in which I think you can argue that they are both showing that, well, Socrates says this straightforwardly in Plato's Symposium: wisdom is impossible, philosophy is possible, and in fact, it's the highest good for a human being. Right.
So the work of philosophy is absolutely necessary.
It is. So so what he is also therefore saying, and this is what they agree on, is that when you do act, you're having to act as if you're wise. And you have to do that. If you want to do something just, you have to act as if your opinion about what justice is true, and then act. Otherwise, you're never going to act. So philosophy can undermine action. It's a genuine danger, right? Because we know that it's people of principle and conviction who achieve things. So there's a real problem if philosophy undermines that, and that's why Cicero, Xenophon, Plato and Aristotle write in such a way as to try and allow people not to have their convictions undermined whilst examining them, which is a delicate balance.
Look, I'm probably wrong, but I remember reading, I think it was last year, some commentary on, it might have been Socrates and the use of reason, where he said ultimately you could reach a state of, you work to understand what virtue is, and you may get a moment of illumination or something like that. So he seemed to be saying that you could know sort of the essence of virtue, or
there's a
But I couldn't take it wrong.
You're actually reminding me. I mean, this is what you're reminding me of, and I may have the wrong passage.
Yeah.
But Plato wrote a series of letters, and in one of them, in which he says, "I will never put into writing what I'm serious about," he then describes what he's serious about. So this is an ironic presentation of his irony, right? But what he does say is that to understand things requires first, having not of the definition, but understanding the discursive description of something, then engaging in discourse about it, and in sum, after thinking and discussing for a considerable period of time, a spark may fly, like between two rough sticks, that illuminates. Now, and that I think is a reference to what he calls elsewhere noesis, or intellectual intuition. So it's not a discursive thing.
Yes,
it's
right.
not a definition that appears in gold letters. But it's that vision in the light of which we build our discursive models of how the world is, and or a description of beauty. Because
so in some sense, being is knowable, or
in some absolutely, I think that's absolutely right. Otherwise, our discourse would be gibberish.
Yes.
We'd just be making stuff up. And so we have to have this aspect of illumination for us to be driven to try and figure things out.
Do you think that letter's authentic?
Yeah, they're all authentic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
No one serious has said they're not authentic.
Okay.
A few people from Oxford have, but they're in the.
What's that?
I'm sorry.
What's Oxford?
Oh no, just the university.
Oh,
I mean, a lot of people.
that's still a university.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's mostly a coffee shop, but there are still people with tenure. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's the seventh letter, right? That's the seventh letter we're talking about.
Yeah.
But that's the one. I thought there was dispute about the others, but
There is dispute. I mean, dispute about he wrote. He we have 30, we're given to understand by Thrasyllus through Diogenes Laertius that he wrote 35 dialogues and 13 letters, which I accept as the classical corpus. And that's what most of our authorities, including Aristotle, he doesn't say 35, but he mentions a lot of the obscure ones that are in that 35.
So we have Plato writing in his own voice.
Yes, yeah, we do. But he's recreating this period of his life. So it's all, the fact that he published those letters is meant to be a lesson in the tension between politics and philosophy that he presumably learnt during it, because during it he thought, I, Plato, who am relatively wise, will go and educate a king in Syracuse in Italy, in Sicily, and I will bring into practice some of my thoughts about what would make a political community thrive and people excellent and happy. And then he finds out that when you argue with a tyrant, they tend to throw you in prison and sell you as a slave. And then he wasn't quite convinced, so he was attracted back by an even better hotel suite and with a bigger pool. And he went back and said, "Okay, we'll give it one more go." Third conference in, tyrant lost his temper, threw him in prison and sold him as a slave. And then this friend of the tyrant's son and of Plato said, "No, really, he's different. This time it's different." And so Plato said, "Okay, last time. Got the boat to Sicily, got off the boat. Things went well for 7 or 8 minutes, and then the guy threw him in prison and sold him as a slave." So after that, he decided, as he says in the 7th letter, unless there is a coincidence between genuine philosophy and political rule, or a ruler becomes a philosopher as opposed to getting a philosopher to come to their court and continually throwing them in prison, then there will be no peace and happiness in human cities. Which is very similar to what he says in the, if you count every line of the Republic up, you get to 4, 7, 3, B, 2 to 5, in which he says that there'll be no end. Socrates says to Glaucon, there'll be no end to evils for the human beings unless those who are now called rulers and dynasts, people with power, genuinely philosophers or philosophers, become rulers.
So was Republic written after all this happened?
All of these were written after all this happened.
All that happened?
Yeah, he edited his books until he died. I mean,
was the Republic written after all the Syracuse stuff?
Oh, everything was written after all the Syracuse.
Okay.
Yeah. Because then he comes back and establishes the academy. And he came back, the person who paid for his fee, I think was the same person who bought the grove in Hecatomea. Hecadamus is a hero who has a shrine and is honoured in the Hecatomea temple garden area. And he bought that region. In Greek, the word is cutting, like it's a precinct. And he bought that for Plato to have a school on, and that became the Hecatomea, the precinct of the shrine of Hecadamus, became the Academia, the academy. And so it's our first university. It lasted 500 years, 800 years. And the model that it started is you have a tutor and a few students, and the tutor guides the students through a book or a mathematical problem or whatever. And that model, which was carried out in Italy and Cambridge and Oxford, and is still carried out at St. John's and almost nowhere else, apart from here, we're doing it. It became the model for learning. And we should stop now. That's it. I feel like we've reached the point. Because the next step would be to open up a larger text, which is Plato's description of how Socrates views earlier philosophy. And we're going to have to be highly selective because we have 18 minutes. So I'll just describe briefly what's going on in this passage, which is on the handout from page 3 onwards. And then we'll read one paragraph together and conclude. Now, what happened here is that Socrates in the Phaedo is in prison, and he's at the end of the dialogue, he drinks the hemlock and dies. So that's his punishment. And during this conversation, he explains to his compatriots, there's 12 people with him, and they're more upset than he is that he's dying. So he's in the odd position of being the person who's about to get killed, comforting the friends who are with him. And as part of this discussion, he reflects back on his early passion for knowledge. I'll read the first two lines of this from 96a, it's about 1 to 5, where Socrates says, "Then listen and I'll tell them to you." That is, his experiences in seeking the causes of everything that comes into being and passes away. So this is his early attempt at cosmology. He says, when I was young, Cebes, I had a wonder. Whenever you see wonder in Plato or Xenophon, Aristotle, there's a touch of the beginning of philosophy, right? A wonderful desire for that wisdom which they call the inquiry into nature. He would no longer call it the inquiry into nature, right? Because, so it seemed to me then to be a superior thing to know the causes of each and everything through what it comes to be, through what it's destroyed, and through what it is. Now, he is indicating already that he doesn't agree with this approach. It seemed to be a superior thing, that is, a better thing than other things. But if you have a universal program for how everything is caused, comes into being, goes out of being, then there's no process that's more superior than any other. You have no basis in nature for your own activity. And he's just gently indicating that, someone like Heraclitus or Empedocles or Democritus has no basis in nature for the superiority of their way of life as philosophers. Right? They can't make the connection between their ordinary experience, which is that we choose what to do every day because we think it's better than doing something else, more profitable, more pleasant, more noble, more just, etc. And he's trying to show that necessary connection between philosophy or science and our ordinary human action of distinguishing the better and the worse. Now, I'm going to skip over a lot of what he says in order to get to in order to get to 98b, which is on page 5. Now, I'm just going to explain the two aspects of previous philosophy that it's been through. The first is a kind of atomism or materialism where people explain the causes of things by saying, well, this thing comes into being through the congregation of atoms or elements or parts. And I'll give you one example. Don't bother going back there in the text, but I'll just give you one example. This is from 96c. He says, for then, when I was raising questions in the way that these earlier philosophers were, he says, I was then so blinded by this inquiry that I unlearned what I thought I knew concerning many things, especially through what, that is, by what cause, does a human being grow. Before then, I used to suppose that it was clear to everyone that it's through eating and drinking. That is, whenever from food, flesh is added to flesh and bones to bones, and thus, according to the same account or proportion, in the same proportion, related things come to be added to everything else. It's then that a bulk that was small becomes greater later. And in this way, the small human being becomes great. And he says, what do you think of my opinion? And Cebes says, well, that's an excellent opinion, because Cebes is attracted to this way of thinking. Now, what the example suggests is the following problem. If I have a certain mass of elements, and I have the same elements and mass them together, and I have a greater mass, that's not a good model for an organic being eating and growing. Because because organic beings will grow into a larger bulk from smaller by eating for a certain period, and then they'll reach their fulfillment, and they'll shrink slightly and pass away. You cannot explain the cause of the activity in the being of the living being in the same way you can of inanimate things. So the cosmologists that he's depicting in this first phase act as if there's one necessary cause that operates for everything: human beings, animals, cosmological beings, inanimate things. And he's pointing out there's a problem because phenomena are of different kinds with different causes. And the cause that operates is different depending upon the kind. So that's why when he says, in my next phase, I was very attracted by Anaxagoras, who says that a mind, a nous, causes everything and orders it, cosmane, puts it into a cosmos. Now, he says, now the reason why that would make sense at this stage, if there's a mind that causes and orders everything, that would explain why we can understand it. Because if an intelligence causes it, and we have an intelligence that's open to it, it makes some sense. And also it explains why things grow and improve and so on. But it doesn't explain the decay and the death so well. It doesn't explain if there was. So he says in this passage, he allows us to see what a mind in this sense, in a restricted sense, is, which is it chooses better or worse. But and he says, so therefore I expected that Anaxagoras would explain why everything in the cosmos is in its best possible condition, why everything is good for each individual thing and for the good as a whole. The problem with that view is that what's good for the lion is not always good for the deer. And so it's difficult to explain just by simple human reason why everything is in the best possible condition for each individual thing and the whole. That's not straightforwardly available. And then he gets Anaxagoras' book, because he's heard this phrase, mind orders and controls all things. He gets the book and he says, I was disappointed. He didn't explain to me why everything is in the best possible condition. And if we look at 98b, he says, from a wondrous hope, my companion, I was quite cast down when in my going on and reading, I see a man who has made no use of his nous, of his intellect. Like that's where he makes this joke about, he posits that nous causes all things, and then he made no use of his nous. Nor charged any causes with being the causes responsible for ordering matters. Instead, but rather made air and ether and water and many other strange things the causes. So Anaxagoras has for some reason reverted to the original project of making material causes the causes of all things. Now, Socrates says, in my opinion, his condition was most like this. Now, and this is where we get just a glimpse of how Socrates, as opposed to these other thinkers, approaches things. He says, it was as if someone who says that Socrates accomplishes everything he does by intellect. Right? And now we say human beings have intelligence and they act upon their opinions and so on. And first, then, when he attempts to state the causes of each thing I do, he were to say first that it's through the following, through the following causes that I am sitting here now, that my body is composed out of bones and sinews, and the bones are solid and have joints by which they are separated from one another, and the sinews, which are wrapped around the bones with the flesh and skin that contains them, are able to tense and relax. Thus, since the bones are suspended in the sockets, the sinews make me able to bend my legs by slackening and tightening, and through this cause I am sitting here with my legs bent. So that's the cause of sitting here, and now he's going to talk about speech. And then in turn, concerning my conversing with you, he would state other similar causes, alleging the causes to be voices, air, hearing, and a myriad other such things, neglecting to state, okay, so far we have, you could substitute for this a very complicated explanation based upon brain chemistry and brain imaging showing which synapses are alighting at which particular time and which part of the brain, or you could talk about the historical process and the ethos that is imbued into particular people by its linguistic structure and its ethnicity and so on and so forth, anything that abstracts from our experience and reduces our experience to something else could be substituted for this explanation about either, the makeup of the body and the material cause of speech. He's going to try and say that all of that eradicates what's immediately intelligible to us and must be the beginning point of our inquiry. Okay, so now he's about to say, this is at E1, he says, by doing any of that in any of those modes, they are neglecting to state the true causes. So the true cause of him sitting there, which we happen to know from this previous dialogue, the Crito, where Socrates is about to wake up in prison the day before, and Crito knocks open the earth of the prison cell. His head sticks up and he says, "I just dug a tunnel, come with me, we're going to escape." And he persuades him to go away because he's going to allow himself to be put to death. So we know that he's deliberately decided to stay there. Right, so now he's going to say, neglecting to state the true cause. What's the true cause of his death? That, when it was the opinion of the Athenians that it was better to convict me, it's through this, okay, that's the condition. If they didn't convict him to death, he wouldn't be doing this, right? But they did. So it's through this that it has become my opinion that it's better for me to sit here, and that it's more just to remain and undergo whatever penalty they order, that is, the execution. Now, so each word's important, right? As it always is, but I'll just try and bring out a couple. It was the opinion of the Athenians that creates the condition for the possibility of his action. Then it became his opinion. So what's the true cause of human action is opinion. Not knowledge, not wisdom, opinion, right? And the opinion is always that it's better to do something. It's better and more just. There's no such thing as justice per se, right? In a human action. It's more just to do this than to do something else. It's better to do this than to do something. We never meet with anything unqualified in our life, right? Okay. Since, by the dog, an unusual Socratic oath, as I think, these sinews and bones would long ago have been in Megara or Boeotia, carried off there by an opinion of what is best, if I did not think it more just and more noble, so these relative qualifications, to undergo at the hands of the city whatever penalty it sets, rather than escaping and fleeing. So the bones and sinews by themselves the body has a good, which is to remain whole. And so if the body was directing his action, it would have, the body was, it's impossible, but if the body had a mind, it would escape, because it would then remain whole. But because he's a complicated human being, which is an animated body, he has principles of action that are not merely related to survival. Okay, now, in the last line on this page, he says, to state that I do whatever I do through these things, through the bones and the sinews and the neurons and so on. So you act through these elements, and that you do them by intellect rather than by the choice of what is best would be, this is an odd phrase, but a very extensive slackness of spirit and argument. So just laziness, let's just say that would be lazy. For that would be not to be able to distinguish, one, what the cause is in its being, and two, that without which the cause could never be a cause. So if someone said to him, look, you have to have a brain to think, therefore the brain causes your action, he would say, of course, the brain is the condition for the possibility of my being able to experience life as a human. But having synapses is not the same as the experience of this is more noble than that, or beautiful than that, or just than that, on a human level. And that it's the experience on that level that is the beginning point of our activity, including the investigation of brain neurology or whatever, all of those activities come within this fundamental human perspective of acting because we think one thing is better than another. And any thesis that elides that experience lacks validity. Okay, so that's, yeah, I think we're staggered to a halt, but if do you have any...
I'm really keen for you to finish that.
No.
Oh, it's getting to
It's 7:58.
I have some slackness for spirits of my understanding, like I'm quite sure about, yeah.
We have gone very rapidly, and I haven't done justice to anything, which is why I'm hesitant, Bernie, to...
Well, I just thought then, you see, because I just thought then he then says, that's why I got into definitions and that's why I got into forms and that's how I got into being interested in forms. But you see it differently.
That's exactly the same as what I'm saying, but I'm understanding the forms differently, possibly.
Okay.
Yeah, because he says exactly the same as what I am saying here, which is that the cause of human action is opinion. That's exactly what I mean by hypothesizing the forms, which means if you're saying that human beings act because of their opinion that something is better rather than worse, more noble, more just, more pleasant, more profitable, whatever the principle is, then you're hypothesizing by that act or by that speech that there is such a thing as beauty, justice, nobility. So the 3 times that he discusses what are called the Platonic forms in dialogues where he discusses it in its relation to ordinary life. On each occasion, he says, I hupos tithemi. I'll just put this on the board. He says, there's a preposition, hupo, which means under. It means under, from underneath or underneath something. It also means doing something in secret. There are all these words which, if you add hupo to it, it means to do that activity in secret. In tragedy, it's everywhere like that. But here it's this word, hypotithemi. Tithemi, which has one of its nominal forms is thesis. Thesis. Which, a thesis is something you propound. You put it down, you establish it. You establish a thesis. Tithemi means to place, put, establish, render, make something so and so. Here it means to place under, which is an older sense of the word hypothesis. And here it means, he says, he means under our discourse. I posit that there is, prior to discourse, a intelligible aspect of beauty or justice or whatever it is that we apprehend non-discursively, and that our discourse then images. Right? And something like that must be true if human experience has any reality, because we can describe the same phenomena in different languages, and they have different perspectives on the same phenomena. Right? What we call human nobility, there's no, like in English, we could say noble. We would not say, I like the word noble. I think it's a noble word. We should use it regularly. But I don't think you would see it if you opened Sydney Morning Herald, or, you're not going to see the word noble. So they would say something, well, I don't know if they'd say anything intelligent. What do we use?
There is a footballer called John Noble.
Yeah, well, there you go. I'm glad it still makes an appearance. But, like in Latin, you would have maybe honestum, what in German, edel, or forename. In Greek, kalos. But you've also got ganios. And all of them have different backgrounds and different associations. None of them matches one to the other at all. Right? In no language is there a one-to-one match. So when you start to learn Greek, it's very good to get a one-to-one word translation and just stick to it. So kalos, I'm just going to translate that beautiful whenever I see it. Right? You need that help to get going. But ultimately, you're reading it as kalos, which has a whole different range of associations than beauty or nobility, which is why neither of those are adequate translations. That's what happens when you gradually learn a language. You begin to acquire those associations, which are different from every other language, because there is no direct correspondence. And that, yeah, which is what he means is that he's not talking about other languages, but he may as well be. He's saying we hypothesize, if we take beauty or nobility seriously, it's because we hypothesize that there is such a thing in our speaking about it. If we're arguing about it's ignoble or noble to do X or Y, if we're arguing about it, we are both implicitly hypothesizing that it is. So that's why the very most common arguments for saying that there are no such principles of human life now are fairly self-refuting, because the argument is, well, there's 7 different opinions, so therefore there's no such thing. On the contrary, that's proof, because everyone believes that there is justice. They just disagree violently about what justice is. There's no stronger proof that everyone thinks that there is such a thing as justice. Right?
Every time in my introductory class, people don't get that. Yeah, we say that every time, they don't get it. Oh, no, everyone's got a different idea of justice, but you just use the word justice. You know, so you think there's justice.
Yeah. See, it's difficult when you have classes in which there's no marking of papers, because it's very easy to show that they too think there's such a thing as justice when you say everyone under the height of X or whatever it is, make up some criteria, will fail. And then half the class will protest, and then you'll have demonstrated that they think there is such a thing as justice. We're already taking you past time, so. But yeah, we're leaving many depths untouched, let alone explored. But there are many more courses, so I hope you will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Martin, thank you very much for a terrific course.
Oh, thanks, Alan. It's good to see you again too. I'm glad you had some free time after the last class to come along. So thank you for that.
Thank you.